Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. We're going to wander through dimly lit corridors of history, not to hear the usual tales of battles and triumphs, but to discover something far more delicate, and perhaps far more human. The most embarrassing royal deaths ever recorded. These are not the kinds of stories carved into monuments or sung by poets, but the awkward exits, the ridiculous missteps, the fragile ends that remind us even kings and queens were never above the small cruelties of chance. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. History, when spoken slowly in the quiet of night, has a way of losing its sharp edges. The clang of swords and the shouts of battle fade, and instead what lingers is the strange fragility of kings and queens, who are supposed to be untouchable, yet prove to be as vulnerable as any weary traveller crossing a dark road. Tonight the candle burns low, and we begin with a crown, one that slipped far too soon from the head it was meant to rest upon. There is something almost comical, if not deeply ironic, in the way that power once perched itself upon mortal brows. A crown is heavy, more than it seems in portraits and statues, more than a glittering ornament resting lightly on velvet. It is made to press down, to remind the one who wears it that the burden of ruling is not soft gold, but hardened metal. And yet, for one unlucky king, the weight of his crown was not metaphorical at all. It was literal, sudden, and fatally embarrassing. Imagine the court of Bohemia in the early 15th century. The tapestries hang stiff with the dust of years, and the air inside the hall is thick with incense, as though one could not quite tell whether it was meant for the living or the dead. King Wenceslaus IV was no stranger to ridicule in life. He was called lazy, indulgent, too fond of wine, and far too quick to anger. But it was not his mismanagement of politics that marked his end in whispers. It was how he slipped out of the world, clumsily, like a guest leaving a banquet too early, and tripping on the steps. The story drifts between accounts, but all agree on this much. He died not in a blaze of glory, not in a storm of battle, not even with words of wisdom on his lips. Instead, as the weight of summer pressed upon him, and he withdrew to his chamber, the king lay down to rest, crown still on his head. Perhaps he was drunk, perhaps merely exhausted, perhaps lulled into a stupor by his own indifference. Whatever the cause, the crown that he refused to remove shifted as he drifted into uneasy sleep. And there, with no audience but a few terrified attendants, the golden circlet slipped, pressed against his neck, and left the king struggling for breath. It was no assassin's blade, no poisoner's craft, just the clumsy gravity of his own vanity. To die beneath one's own crown is not merely tragic, it is absurd. The courtiers who found him could hardly speak of it. Imagine their silence, staring at the sight of majesty undone by nothing more than a tilted angle of gold and gemstones. To say aloud that the King of Bohemia had been choked by his crown was to reduce the great theatre of monarchy to farce. And so, in the days that followed, the tale spread only in murmurs careful and hushed, as though the absurdity of it might itself be contagious. Yet history has a habit of remembering precisely what is most uncomfortable. The battles he lost, the negotiations he bungled, the crown lands he squandered. Those blur together with the passing of centuries. But the crown slipping from his head as he lay heavy with wine, crushing the breath from him, that image remains. A monarch reduced to the role of a child who cannot sleep without fumbling in his bed. And one must ask, was it fate, or was it some cruel joke of the universe? For kings were supposed to be symbols of divine order, And yet the divine order in this case seemed to find humour in reminding humanity that power does not make the body less fragile. One slip, one tilt of gold upon flesh, and the man who ruled a kingdom was gone. The courtiers covered the truth in ceremony, as courts always do. The bells tolled, the church filled with incense, the dirges echoed through stone halls. The official proclamation spoke of sudden illness, of God's mysterious will. But behind heavy curtains, where whispers are safest, the truth was too delicious not to share. Even in grief, a snicker may escape, and one can imagine servants struggling not to smile as they polished the same crown that had turned into an executioner's hand. And so, the story of Wenceslaus passed quietly into the annals of embarrassing ends, where kings are not noble martyrs, but fragile bodies betrayed by their own trappings. The crown that should have been his symbol of eternity became the very object that robbed him of breath. There is no sword here, no clash of nations, no bold last words, just the awkward sound of metal sliding askew, and silence that followed. But history does not pause. It rarely allows one absurdity to stand alone. When a king dies in embarrassment, it seems to open a door for other strange departures, as though the royal courts of Europe found themselves haunted not by ghosts of glory, but by shadows of clumsiness and folly. If a crown could betray its wearer, then surely a feast, or a hunt, or a simple act of laughter could do the same. As the body of the king was laid in its coffin, as the crown was polished and readied for the next trembling brow, the courtiers perhaps felt a strange chill, not of grief, but of recognition. They too wore the costumes of power, the heavy fabrics, the ceremonial chains. And in their silence they must have realised the objects that lifted them above common men were also the objects that might bring them down. The image lingers, a crown gleaming faintly in torchlight, tilted just enough to remind us that majesty is fragile, and that sometimes the greatest humiliation waits not in the eyes of enemies, but in the quiet weight of one's own symbols. Thus, the crown that slipped too soon became a warning and a whisper in the courts of Europe. It was spoken of softly, like a bedtime tale for courtiers too cautious to laugh aloud. And as night stretches longer, we turn gently onward, for Wenceslaus was far from alone in meeting his end with awkwardness that history could never quite forgive. The hush that fell over the chamber after the crown's betrayal did not linger long. Power abhors a vacuum, and courts move swiftly from mourning to appetite, as though feasting itself could bury the shame of an awkward end. So it was that another hall, lit by torches and heavy with roasted meats, became the stage for a death no less humiliating, though wrapped in silk and song. A banquet is supposed to be a celebration of life. It is where kings remind their subjects of plenty, where music and laughter drown out whispers of famine and unrest. The long tables groan under the weight of roasted fowl, sugared fruits, pies so heavily spiced that they seem to defy the dullness of winter. Wine flows in jugs of silver, and goblets clink in careless rhythm. Yet beneath such splendour lies danger, for indulgence is as treacherous as any battlefield. One monarch, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, became a cautionary tale not for his failures in politics, but for his victory at the dinner table, a victory so complete that it devoured him. He was no stranger to rich meals, but on a certain evening he seemed determined to make himself an eternal legend of gluttony. Picture the scene: chandeliers swaying with candlelight, courtiers leaning close to gossip, the air thick with the scents of cabbage soup, lobster, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, an orchestra of flavours, each dish louder than the last. The king ate with enthusiasm, not delicately as etiquette books demanded, but with a kind of childlike abandon that made courtiers smile nervously. For who dares correct a king who eats too much? To whisper restraint is to risk offence, and so silence filled the room as the monarch reached again and again for more. What began as a royal dinner became a contest between appetite and mortality. The servants brought course after course, and still he signalled for more. His favourites, it was said, were sweet buns soaked in hot milk, served steaming, soft as pillows, sweet as lullabies. One bun followed another, then another, until 14 of them rested uneasily within him, like stones laid one upon the other. The courtiers kept their faces still, though surely they felt a prickle of unease. The body is not a bottomless vault, and even kings must bow to the limits of flesh. But Adolf Frederick laughed, flushed with wine, declaring that he felt himself as blessed as the gods. He leaned back, his robe slipping slightly from one shoulder, and the hall echoed with a brittle kind of laughter, the sound of people too afraid to show their concern. And then, as the night wore on and the plates were cleared, silence thickened. The king pressed a hand to his stomach. His face, red from wine, grew pale. Servants froze, courtiers exchanged wary glances, the music faltered into stillness. He shifted, tried to laugh again, tried to assure the room that he was merely full. But the weight of excess does not forgive. The same abundance that once symbolized power turned against him with cruel finality. The feast that should have been remembered for joy became his undoing. The King of Sweden, lord of a cold land where food was a symbol of triumph over nature, was brought low by the very thing he prized most. Death came not with a blade or a plot, but in the quiet of digestion betrayed. He was found later, slumped in his chamber, the banquet still heavy within him. The official word was a stroke, yet those who had sat in that hall, who had watched him swallow greedily, knew the truth. He had feasted himself into eternity. It is difficult to imagine a more embarrassing end for a ruler. To die in battle is glory. To die of poison is intrigue. To die beneath the weight of one's own appetite is absurd. A man who ruled over armies, who signed decrees and bent nobles to his will, felled by cabbage soup, lobster, champagne, and softened in milk. The court dressed the truth in silence, but silence cannot hide irony. And so the tale drifted beyond Sweden, across Europe, whispered in taverns, chuckled over in faraway palaces. In the stillness of night, one wonders if the courtiers recalled the moment the music stopped, the sudden hush that fell over the hall, and the uneasy recognition that kings are not gods, but frail creatures capable of eating themselves into oblivion. Perhaps they thought of their own indulgences, of the sweet wines they sipped too freely, of the heavy feasts where gluttony pressed upon them like a second cloak. For in every royal death there lies not only humiliation, but also a reflection of those who served them. The banquet table, cleared of its dishes, must have seemed an altar afterward, silent and accusing. Plates that had once shimmered with delicacies now stood empty, as though mocking the hunger that had swallowed their king. The servants who had carried dish after dish must have replayed the evening in their minds, wondering if they should have stopped sooner, wondering if their obedience had played a part. But obedience was the duty of the lowly. A king's appetite was law, even when it led him toward death. And so the banquet became a tale of silence, not the silence of reverence, but the silence of embarrassment. There were no stirring ballads composed for Adolf Frederick. No grand epics of his reign lingered in memory. Instead, history remembers him as the king who ate until his body could hold no more. The torches that had flickered over the feast burned low, their wax dripping onto stone. The echo of laughter faded, and as night folded its heavy wings over the palace, the lesson of that banquet settled in. The trappings of power are not always crowns or sceptres. Sometimes they are platters, silver spoons, goblets filled again and again, and sometimes they betray their masters in the most humiliating fashion. But death, once it enters the banquet hall, does not linger in a single seat. It wanders onward, searching for new stages, new disguises. If it could claim a king through his crown, and another through his appetite, then surely it could just as easily stalk the forest paths, where rulers hunted as though they were gods of the wilderness. And so the story drifts onward, away from the table with its empty plates, into the shadowed woods where another monarch's fate awaited him among the trees. The halls that once echoed with the clatter of dishes and the strained laughter of overeating faded into silence, and in that silence, kings and courtiers often sought escape in the open air. The forest, vast and ancient, promised something different, an arena where rulers could prove themselves not with words or feasts, but with bow and spear. To hunt was to remind the world that even a man wrapped in velvet and crown still carried the instincts of a predator. Yet the forest does not bow to rank, and the beasts of the wild do not read decrees. In those tangled woods, the line between hunter and hunted has always been thinner than kings imagined. So it was with William II of England, known to history as William Rufus, a king whose hair glowed red like embers, and whose temper burned much the same. He reigned in the shadow of his father, the Conqueror, never quite able to wear the crown without it slipping awkwardly on his head. Yet for all his faults, he loved the hunt, loved it with the fervour of a man who thought the forest itself bent in deference to him. The royal hunt was no simple ride. It was a spectacle, a theatre of dominance. Nobles dressed in finery that seemed impractical among branches and mud, servants ran ahead with horns, and hounds strained at their leashes. The crashing of hooves and the thunder of shouts made the green world tremble, and at the centre of it rode the king, flushed with the thrill of power, his bow in hand, eager to loose arrows as though each shaft might remind his courtiers that he was more than just a ruler behind stone walls. Yet nature does not stage its plays for human pride. The summer sun sank lower, the shadows stretched long between the trees, and the deer stirred in nervous clusters. In that uneasy half-light, where branches cut the sky into jagged shapes, an arrow flew. Whether loosed by the king himself, or by one of his companions, no one could say with certainty afterward. What is remembered is the cry that split the air, the heavy thud of a body falling from horseback, and the stunned silence that followed. The king, the red-haired William Rufus, lay sprawled upon the forest floor, an arrow deep in his chest. There was no grand duel, no final roar of defiance, only the confused rustle of leaves, the sudden quiet of animals retreating into the underbrush, and the wide-eyed stares of courtiers who could not decide whether to help their monarch or to flee before being blamed. Some whispered later that it had been no accident at all, that Sir Walter Tyrrell, a companion in the hunt, had aimed too well, that politics had guided his hand. But the truth that lingers is not the intrigue of plots, but the absurdity of the setting. A king, the son of a conqueror, felled not by an army, but by a misfired arrow in a forest clearing, surrounded not by enemies, but by startled nobles too frightened to speak. The most embarrassing detail of all was not his death itself, but what followed. For when a king dies in the open woods, ceremony does not arrive swiftly. His body lay abandoned for hours, left by companions who scattered, unwilling to be caught in the scandal of blame. The great hunter, who had so often boasted of mastery over beasts, lay still among the ferns, his regal robes muddied, his crown far away, his blood darkening the moss. A swineherd, not a knight, was the one to carry him back, slung roughly across a cart, as though he were no more than an animal himself. Imagine it! A monarch who had feasted in great halls, who had demanded loyalty with the weight of his father's conquest behind him, reduced in the end to a body jostling awkwardly on a peasant's cart, branches scratching at the fabric that once shone in torchlight. No herald announced his return. No triumphal bells rang. Only the creaking of wheels and the silence of villagers staring as the Red King passed through their midst, without breath. In that humiliation lies the irony of royal death. The hunt, meant to be a symbol of virility, of strength, of noble dominion over nature, turned against him. It was not the stag that fell, but the king. Not the beast's body carried on shoulders, but the sovereign's. Power was revealed for what it always was, fragile, breakable, no more protected by crown or title than any other creature beneath the indifferent canopy of trees. The courtiers who once shouted encouragement at his side spoke little afterwards. Official words were written, excuses carved into parchment, tales of accident smoothed into the language of fate. Yet behind closed doors, one imagines them whispering the truth with a kind of nervous laughter, that their king, mighty in name, had been undone by nothing more than a shaft of wood and feather, loose clumsily in the half-light of an ordinary day. The forest itself seemed to hold the memory. Long after William Rufus was buried, travellers swore that the place where he fell held an uneasy air, as if the trees themselves remembered the folly of the hunt. A stone was raised, but stones are mute. It was the story, not the marker, that lived on. The story of a king felled by his own pastime, abandoned by his own companions, carried home by hands that had never expected to touch a monarch. And thus the hunt, once a display of majesty, became instead a warning carved into the annals of kingship, that the forest does not bend to crowns, that arrows fly where they will, and that even rulers who believe themselves masters of beasts may find themselves mistaken. The silence that followed his passing did not end in the woods. It drifted back into the halls of power, where nobles gathered uneasily around tables, avoiding one another's eyes, speaking softly as though sound itself might conjure the ghost of the Red King. It drifted into the whispers of peasants, who chuckled in secret at the irony that one who had ruled them with such force had been carried home like a stag after the hunt. And from that silence, history carried the tale onwards. For kings and queens, after all, sought honour not only in forests and feasts, but in moments of joy as well, moments when laughter filled the air, like music. Yet laughter, like crowns, like banquets, like hunts, could betray just as easily. In courts where jesters played and queens leaned back in delight, death sometimes crept in with the sound of laughter itself, waiting for the moment when joy became the strangest and most humiliating curtain call of all. From the shadowed stillness of the woods, where arrows misfired and pride fell silent, history drifts into the glitter of candlelit chambers. The sound changes, no longer the rustle of leaves, but the soft hum of conversation, the clink of goblets, and above all, the rippling of laughter. Courts loved laughter, for it masked unease, filled the gaps between politics, and turned heavy evenings into something bearable. To laugh was to remind one's companions that life, though fragile, could still shimmer with joy. Yet even joy has its sharp edge, and sometimes the most innocent sound becomes the cruelest ending. It was in the court of Denmark, in the 17th century, that Queen Catherine, consort to King Eric, discovered how laughter could turn traitor. She was a woman of lively spirit, remembered more for her humour than for solemnity. Where others wore their dignity stiffly, She let hers slip now and then, delighting courtiers with sudden wit, gestures that dissolved stiffness into merriment. To see a queen laugh so openly was a reminder that even rulers carried hearts capable of lightness. The hall that evening was bright with torches. A feast had been held, music had filled the air, and when the plates were cleared, the entertainment began. A jester, quick-witted and bold, leapt forward with antics designed to draw laughter from even the most stone-faced noble. His movements were ridiculous, his timing precise, and the room swayed with mirth. The queen, more than any other, delighted in it. She leaned forward, eyes sparkling, her laughter clear and unrestrained, ringing above the rest like the peal of a silver bell. But laughter, when it comes too freely, can betray the body. Breath is its companion, and when breath falters, mirth twists suddenly into danger. Catherine laughed long and hard, until her face grew flushed, until her attendants urged her gently to take pause. Yet she could not. Each jest, each fall, each exaggerated grimace from the jester struck her anew, and she gasped between giggles, unable to stop the flood of joy. What began as merriment grew strange. The queen pressed a hand to her chest, tears of laughter streaming down her face. She tried to steady herself, to sip from a goblet, but the effort failed. The courtiers, uncertain, continued to smile, unsure whether her struggle was part of the jest or a sudden misfortune. And then, without warning, her laughter broke into choking, her body trembling as though shaken by invisible hands. The hall stilled, music faltered, voices hushed, and the jester froze mid-gesture, horror spreading across his painted face. The queen collapsed, her laughter still echoing even as her breath refused to return. What moments before had seemed the purest joy became a grotesque scene of helpless gasping. The attendants rushed to her, but there was nothing to be done. Breath, once broken, does not easily mend. And so, with laughter still caught upon her lips, Catherine slipped from the world. A queen dying in battle might be immortalized. A queen succumbing to intrigue might inspire legend. But a queen undone by laughter, what song could preserve that with dignity? The courtiers, stricken with shame, hurried to cloak the truth. Official words spoke of sudden illness, of frailty unknown until that very evening. But no cover of parchment could conceal the whispers. They spread quickly, carried in low voices, embroidered with irony, the queen who laughed herself into the grave. There is a cruelty in such an ending, for what could be more innocent, more human than laughter? And yet the very sound that lifted her above the weight of crown and duty became her undoing. The court never quite forgot the image, the flicker of torchlight on her tear-streaked face, the echo of joy twisting into silence, the stunned stillness of nobles who did not know whether to weep or to fear the shame of their own amusement. And what of the jester? He too became a figure of strange sorrow. Once prized for his gift of levity, he now carried the weight of blame, whether deserved or not. His jokes, once cherished, grew heavy with guilt. To be remembered as the one whose jest turned fatal is a burden no entertainer desires. In his silence afterwards, history sees the shadow of irony. The laughter he sought to summon had instead summoned death. The story of Catherine's end rippled outward beyond the walls of Denmark. Other courts, upon hearing it, stiffened their manners. Laughter became more restrained, more careful, as though joy itself had to be moderated lest it betray them as it had betrayed her. And yet the tale endured not as a caution against mirth, but as one of history's quiet absurdities. A queen remembered not for policy, nor for grandeur, but for a final, unstoppable laugh. It is in such moments that royalty appears most fragile. For all the pomp of ceremony, for all the weight of jewels and crowns, what ended her life was nothing more than air caught and lost in the convulsions of laughter. No assassin, no rival, no battle, only breath turned cruel. And so, even centuries later, the tale rests uneasily in the annals of monarchy, a reminder that dignity can collapse into absurdity in the span of a heartbeat. Perhaps the most haunting thought of all is that her death was not filled with fear, but with joy. To leave the world in laughter seems, in some lights, a gift, and yet, in the heavy courts of Europe, it was seen as embarrassment, a breach of dignity, a story whispered but never proudly proclaimed. A queen's life measured in jewels and decrees, undone by a jest too sharp, a laugh too long. The chamber where it happened never felt the same afterward. Servants moved quietly through it, as though echoes of her laughter still clung to the walls. Courtiers lowered their voices, reluctant to disturb the uneasy memory. And those who had been present at that feast carried the image forever. The sudden shift from merriment to mourning, the crownless fragility of royalty revealed in a moment of uncontrollable mirth. From forest hunts to feasts of excess, from crowns that pressed too heavily to laughter that would not stop, the pattern becomes clear. Power may dress itself in symbols, but death delights in irony. And if laughter could steal away a queen, then surely other chambers, more private, more humiliating still, could also claim their victims in ways history could never dress in dignity. And so the story drifts on, leaving behind the sound of fading laughter, moving toward another chamber where rulers met their end, not with joy, nor with triumph, but with shameful silence in the most undignified of places. The sound of laughter, so recently alive in the glittering halls of a queen's court, fades into quieter chambers, rooms where no music played, where no courtiers dared linger long, and where the body reminded rulers that crowns could not disguise its most ordinary needs. Behind velvet curtains and gilded doors, even kings were reduced to creatures of flesh, seeking relief in solitude. Yet history, with its cruel humour, sometimes chose to intrude at the very moment when dignity was most absent. So it was with King George II of Great Britain, a monarch whose reign held wars, politics and treaties, but who is remembered most vividly for the humiliating setting of his death. Not on the battlefield, not in the throne room, not even in bed surrounded by solemn attendants, but on a far humbler seat, in a private chamber that no artist would ever dare to paint with grandeur. The morning was like many others, grey with the damp air of London, the palace stirring awake as servants moved softly through corridors. The king, older now, accustomed to routine, excused himself to his private closet. To speak plainly, it was the lavatory, though in palaces such rooms were dressed with as much dignity as possible, lined with wood panels, draped perhaps with a little velvet, a chair fitted with a porcelain bowl beneath. Even so, no embroidery could change its purpose. And it was there, in this hidden room of necessity, that the end came swiftly. A rupture of the heart, they said, a sudden burst that left him without warning. Servants, after waiting uncomfortably long, discovered him fallen, still upon the seat, his body crumpled in the most undignified position. A king, second of his name, ruler of realms, found not in bed beneath embroidered sheets but beside the toilet, his body reminding the world that sovereignty does not grant exemption from human frailty. The court panicked, of course. Death itself was not shocking. George was in his 70s after all, but the manner of it was unbearable to acknowledge. To speak openly that their king had died in such a private moment was to strip majesty bare, and so they rush to cloak the truth in respectable words. Sudden illness, apoplexy, a seizure while at his closet. Language softened what reality made harsh, but no careful phrasing could erase the image. Behind the official lines, whispers spread quickly, giggled in taverns, repeated in low voices, even among nobles. The king who ruled a mighty empire had died upon a seat no throne maker would claim. What lingers most is not the medical detail, but the shame of place. For the lavatory, however dressed, is where one is most human, most vulnerable, stripped of ceremony. To perish, there is to be caught in the act of living as all mortals do, no different from servant or subject. That is why it embarrassed his court so deeply, why history remembers it with a smirk. The throne of Britain was powerful, but it could not protect its occupant from being remembered for a lesser throne entirely. And yet, one must imagine the irony with care. George II had been a soldier, a man who once rode at the Battle of Dettingen, the last British monarch to lead his troops in person. He had known the roar of cannons, the chaos of cavalry, the press of men fighting for empire. To survive all that, only to meet his end quietly in a lavatory, seems almost too pointed, as though history itself chose satire over solemnity. The courtiers who discovered him surely struggled with their expressions. Grief mixed with shock, and behind shock lurked embarrassment. To touch the body, to lift it, to carry it through corridors where others might see, these tasks fell not to ministers or princes, but to servants, who whispered later of the indignity, their voices carrying the story outward into the world beyond. No proclamation could contain it once it escaped their lips. Even his funeral, grand as it was, could not wash the stain from memory. The coffin lay in Westminster, the organ played, the nation mourned. But for those who knew, the image of their monarch, slumped in his private chamber, clung like a stubborn shadow. Centuries later, when his name is recalled, it is not treaties or victories that spring to mind, but that single, humiliating scene. There is a strange democracy in such deaths. A peasant might die in a field, a merchant at his stall, a servant in the corner of a draughty room. A king, for all his splendour, may die upon the toilet. The body respects no titles, and the places where it fails are often the most unceremonious. History seems to delight in preserving these moments, not to mock the dead cruelly, but to remind the living that majesty is only borrowed, never owned. And so the image endures. George II, once a soldier, once a ruler of empires, undone by the sudden betrayal of his own heart in a room meant for solitude. A throne beside the toilet. This became his final seat, the one history refused to forget. The tale might bring unease, even laughter, but behind it lies something more sombre. These embarrassing deaths, whether by crown, by feast, by hunt, or by laughter, are not just oddities to amuse. They are reminders of fragility, of the absurd ways in which life's ending interrupts ceremony. And as courtiers whispered the story of their king, as servants carried the truth into the streets, it must have seemed that no chamber, no matter how private, could truly protect the powerful from history's gaze. From there, whispers grew into stories, and stories into legend. The halls of Europe, listening, must have trembled slightly at the thought. If even lavatories could claim kings, then what other humiliations might wait? Banquet tables, forests, laughter-filled halls, gilded chambers, all seemed suddenly dangerous. And yet rulers went on, feasting, hunting, laughing, retiring to their private closets, never knowing when absurdity might slip its hand into their final scene. In the stillness of night, one can almost hear the echoes of their endings, the slide of a crown, the silence of a banquet, the thud of a body in the forest, the gasp of laughter too long held, the fall of a monarch in his private chamber. Each is bound together by a single thread, the irony of dignity undone. And from the hush of that hidden room, where George II met his fate, the story drifts once more, into other halls, other nights, where celebrations turned sour, and joy itself became the stage for humiliating end. Banquets have always been dangerous places for kings. The table, so heavy with roasted birds, spiced wines, and gleaming silver, carries not only the promise of celebration, but also the weight of expectation. Eyes watch how a ruler eats, how he raises a cup, how he laughs at a jest. A feast can flatter, but it can also betray. And in the glittering halls where music plays and torches burn, death sometimes waits in the guise of merriment. So it was with Charles II of Navarre, remembered less for his reign than for the pitiful, humiliating way his life slipped from him. His court called him Charles the Bad, a nickname earned not by misfortune, but by cruelty and ambition. Yet for all his plotting and cunning, his end was neither grand nor cunning, but absurd, like a cruel joke told at the end of a long, uneasy evening. The story drifts into the year 1387, when the king had grown frail. He was not old by the measures of monarchs, but illness gnawed at him. Still, duty compelled appearances. The occasion was a wedding feast, grand, excessive, the kind where every dish arrives, not merely to satisfy hunger, but to prove wealth, lineage, and divine favour. Picture the hall. Banners embroidered with lions and fleur-de-lis, musicians plucking strings in the gallery, courtiers in silks shimmering beneath candlelight. The king sat at the high table, his body weakened though his pride demanded that he endure the spectacle. Around him, plates piled with roasted swan, spiced boar, candied fruits, goblets filled with rich wine that stained lips red. It is tempting to imagine that he might have wondered, as laughter echoed through the vaulted chamber, whether this would be his last feast. For he was a man who had betrayed allies, turned friends to enemies, woven schemes like webs only to be caught in them himself. Perhaps he felt a shadow creeping behind the golden music. Perhaps not. What we do know is that he drank deeply, his frail body struggling to keep pace with the rituals of festivity. And then, in the quiet hours after the feast, when servants moved about to tend him, came the twist of fate. His physicians, fearing for his failing health, devised a treatment both curious and dangerous. They wrapped him tightly in linen soaked in brandy, believing that such a fiery substance might stimulate his blood, draw life back into weary limbs. It was a practice as strange as it was desperate, a mixture of medicine and superstition. But linen soaked in spirits is as eager for flame as dry tinder in a hearth. And whether by the careless hand of a servant carrying a candle, or the spark of a taper too close to the bed, fire found him. In an instant, the king was transformed into a torch, linen crackling, brandy feeding the flames. His cries tore through the chamber, drowning out the soft clatter of servants rushing in panic. It is said he burned alive, writhing in agony, his body consumed by the very cure meant to save him. A monarch who once plotted across kingdoms ended not in battle, not even in quiet sickness, but in a grotesque accident more fit for a peasant's hut than a royal palace. Those who stood witness could never forget the sight of a king, their king, thrashing in fire like a common drunkard who had fallen asleep too close to the hearth. And when word spread, it carried not the solemn dignity of tragedy, but the sting of ridicule. To die in war was noble, die in bed was natural, but to die in a blaze of medical foolishness. It was humiliation written in flames. His enemies laughed, his allies shuddered, and the people, who had long called him the Bad, whispered that it was a fitting end, justice delivered not by sword, but by accident. Yet the absurdity did not end there, for even in death his body was mocked by the flames. When the fire was quenched and the chamber filled with smoke, little remained of the king but charred cloth and blistered flesh. The sight of it was so pitiful, so unroyal, that courtiers could barely bring themselves to look. And so, the grand feast, the glittering night meant to honour family and dynasty, became instead the stage of his humiliation. One cannot help but notice the irony. A king who had schemed endlessly, who built his life upon cleverness and guile, undone by something as simple as fire meeting brandy. Not a betrayal, not an enemy's dagger, not even the slow decay of nature, but a spark, tiny, ordinary, overlooked. Fate? Aussi cause, shall we use its moments, with a taste for dark comedy. History, always eager for such tales, preserved this ending not because it honoured his reign, but because it embarrassed it. Generals, treaties, alliances, all these fade in memory. But the image of a king flailing in flames after being wrapped like a spirit-soaked effigy, that clings, sharp and cruel, centuries after the smoke dispersed. And so the hall that once rang with wedding laughter now echoes only with whispers of the king's undoing. Where music once swelled, silence lingers. Where the high table once groaned with roasted meats, there remains only the memory of a monarch consumed by his own cure. The wedding feast that was meant to celebrate union, family, and the promise of new life became instead a grim reminder of mortality. It reminds us that joy and ruin often share the same hall, that beneath the shimmer of silk and candlelight lurks the possibility of farce. Kings and queens may rise to power, may command armies, may shape destinies, but they cannot command the manner of their deaths. Charles of Navarre, remembered forever as the Bad, received his final epithet not from his politics, not from his cruelty, but from the sheer absurdity of his exit. And as with so many royal deaths, the humiliation outlived the crown. The story drifts onward, leaving behind the smoke-filled chamber where linen burned and servants wept, carrying with it the lesson that, in palaces, just as in taverns, death can arrive wearing the mask of irony. For the laughter of one banquet may give way to silence, and the throne itself may tremble at the reminder that no feast is ever entirely safe from unwelcome fate. The sound of hooves, the gleam of lances, the roar of the crowd. Tournaments were the theatre of kingship, the place where power disguised itself as pageantry. What better stage for a monarch to show strength than a field dressed in banners, where nobles cheered and knights lowered their spears in mock battle? Yet in the dangerous dance of splintering wood and charging horses, the line between play and peril was thinner than the shaft of a lance itself. No king understood this better, or paid for it more dearly, than Henry II of France. His reign glittered with ambition and adorned itself with chivalric ideals, but it was undone by a single moment in the lists, when sport turned to tragedy and left a dynasty trembling. The year was 1559, Paris restless with festivity. A peace had been signed between France and Spain after long years of war, and the occasion demanded celebration. What could be more fitting, thought Henry, than a tournament? Knights would tilt, crowds would cheer, and the king himself, eager still in his prime, would ride out as champion. The tilt-yard was prepared with all the splendour France could muster. Stands draped in silks rose high above the field, filled with courtiers shimmering in brocades. ladies in jewelled gowns, ambassadors from foreign courts, and the king's own family. Trumpets blared, the air rang with the clatter of hooves striking earth, and lances gleamed in the sunlight. For the people, it was spectacle. For the king, it was proof that peace did not mean softness, that even in festivity, France could show strength. Henry rode with confidence, his armour polished, the golden rays of the Valois crown glittering from his banners. He was a practised horseman, fond of jousts, quick to lower his lance with precision. Yet age had begun its quiet whisper, and behind the polished bravado was a body less certain than it once had been. Still, he would not be outshone. Again and again he entered the lists, unhorsing noble opponents to the wild approval of the crowd. The pageantry was flawless, until a final match was proposed, against Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of the Scottish Guard. It was meant as nothing more than flourish, a king's last ride before retiring in glory. The crowd leaned forward, eager for one more clash of lances. The horses charged, the lances struck, wood splintered in the air, but Montgomery's weapon, shattering on impact, did not fall cleanly away. A jagged splinter pierced through the gap of the king's visor, driving deep into his iron skull. In an instant, triumph turned to horror. The stands fell silent, the festive music stopped, and attendants rushed forward as Henry reeled in the saddle, blood staining his armour. They carried him away, but the wound was mortal. For 10 agonising days he lingered, surgeons probing, prayers whispered in every chapel of Paris, while the court shuddered at the sight of their monarch struck down not by war, not by assassin, but by the sport of a summer's day. It was not merely a death, it was a humiliation. A king who sought to display vigour had instead revealed frailty. The image of him slumped and bleeding from a splintered lance haunted those who had cheered only moments before. The lists, built for celebration, had become the stage of disgrace, and worse still, his death shook the foundations of the Valois line. Henry left behind young sons unprepared for the burdens of rule, children who would become fragile kings. Francis II, Charles IX, Henry III, each troubled, each pulled apart by wars of religion that soon engulfed France. The splinter that pierced Henry's eye seemed to pierce the very heart of his dynasty. A tournament meant to honour peace became the fracture that led to decades of chaos. In taverns and alleys, whispers spread. Was it divine punishment? Was it omen? Some said the lance had been cursed, others that it was retribution for sins of pride. Whatever the cause, the shame of the manner of his death was undeniable. A king, undone not in council chamber or battlefield, but in a joust, killed like a reckless knight playing at games. The irony deepened when one remembered that Henry's queen, Catherine de' Medici, had long hated tournaments. She had begged him not to ride, fearing some ill fate. Yet he dismissed her worries with a smile, insisting that a king must show strength, that to abstain would seem weakness. And so he rode, and so he fell, and so her prophecy became his epitaph. Catherine, watching from her pavilion, saw the splinter strike her husband, and with it saw the fragile peace of France break apart. The funeral that followed was grand, yet beneath the solemn chants lay an unshakable absurdity. Courtiers bowed, ambassadors offered condolences, but in every mind lingered the image of the king, struck down in sport, his helmet pierced by the very weapon meant only to entertain. History, with its sharp memory, held fast to that humiliation. The field where it happened was cleared, the banners taken down, the stands dismantled. But no amount of tidying could erase the stain left upon the Valois. Generations later, when men spoke of Henry II, they did not recount treaties, or campaigns, but the moment when a lance turned merriment into mourning. It is the nature of such deaths that they outlive victories. They are told and retold, not with solemn reverence, but with a half smile of disbelief. How fragile, people murmur, that a dynasty could begin to crumble because a splinter found its way through a visor. How strange that a monarch who commanded armies should be felled by wood and chance. How embarrassing that the stage he built to prove his strength became the scene of his undoing. And so the tale drifts on, leaving behind the tilt yard where cheers turn to silence, carrying with it the uneasy lesson that power parades itself at great risk. For crowns, however glittering, are not helmets against the absurdity of fate, and the games of kings may end as cruelly as their wars. There is a peculiar cruelty in triumph. Just when a ruler believes himself most secure, when banners wave, when feasts swell, when victory crowns his head, fate sometimes chooses that very moment to slip a hand across his throat. Not in the roar of battle, not under the blade of an assassin, but in the quiet betrayal of the body itself, where the smallest obstruction can undo the grandest of ambitions. So it was with King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden, a monarch whose reign was little remembered, but whose death became the stuff of uneasy laughter. He did not fall at war, nor at the hands of conspirators, but at the dinner table, surrounded by delicacies meant to celebrate life rather than end it. The year was 1771, and Sweden stood restless. Political factions tore at one another, the balance of power shifting uneasily between crown and nobles. Adolf Fredrik, caught in the middle, had little true authority, his reign overshadowed by parliaments and intrigue. Yet he was not without his small pleasures, and among them stood the indulgence of the table. Food was his solace, his kingdom at least over his own plate, and he approached it with the same eagerness others gave to conquest. On that fateful evening, the table groaned with bounty. Salmon, lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, meats roasted and glazed, and wines poured without measure. But it was the dessert, rich semler pastries filled with almond paste and drowned in warm milk, that proved most fateful. They were his favourite, and he consumed them not in moderation, but with the delight of a man determined to command his last small domain. One, then another still. 14 in all, heavy with cream, dense with sweetness, swallowed with careless triumph. Courtiers, accustomed to his appetite, looked on without alarm, though whispers may have stirred between them. It was gluttony performed like ritual, the king devouring not only food, but the brief joy it brought, each pastry a small declaration against the indignities of politics that left him powerless. But the body, unamused by defiance, rebelled. Whether it was the sheer weight of the feast pressing upon his stomach, or a morsel that lodged itself in his throat, or his heart burdened by excess, no one could say with certainty. What is certain is that his breath faltered, his face turned pale, and victory soured into panic. The king, master of his table, had been betrayed by it. Servants rushed, physicians summoned, but it was too late. The ruler of Sweden lay still, undone by indulgence. His crown rested heavy, but his belly heavier still, and history seized upon the absurdity. A king who choked, not on politics, not on battle, but on pastries drowned in milk. The courtiers, faced with the pitiful scene, struggled to contain both grief and embarrassment. To announce his death in solemn terms felt almost farcical. The king is dead, they proclaimed, but how to explain the manner of it? Official words softened the truth, describing sudden illness, but whispers flew faster than proclamations. In Stockholm's streets, Laughter rang where mourning should have echoed. The people muttered that their monarch had eaten himself to death, a fate more suited to a tavern drunkard than a king. It was not just death, it was mockery written into memory. A dynasty scarred by the absurdity of one man's appetite. His son, Gustav III, would inherit not only the throne, but also the shadow of his father's humiliation. A reminder that the crown rested upon a family remembered less for grandeur than for gluttony. The irony is sharp. Kings often seek immortality through conquest, through monuments, through laws etched in marble and ink. Yet Adolf Frederick achieved it by accident, remembered not for policy or war, but for pastries. His reign forgotten, his demise eternal, told and retold in kitchens and parlours, as though fate itself preferred the comedy of his end over the solemnity of his life. And perhaps there is a strange justice in it. For what is monarchy if not a theatre of excess, a pageant of too much gold, too much ceremony, too much indulgence? To be undone by too much food seems almost poetic, a final jest written by history itself. Even now, centuries later, Sweden marks the day of his death with a peculiar twist. Semler pastries remain a tradition, eaten in remembrance, though with a hint of mockery. Each bite carries with it the ghost of a king who could not resist, who ate not wisely but too well, and whose victory feast became his epitaph. The hall where he died has long since grown silent, the plates cleared, the goblets empty. But in the hush of memory, one can almost hear the clatter of forks, the laughter of courtiers, the king's satisfied sigh as he lifted yet another pastry, unaware that with it he lifted also the last measure of his reign. Thus the story of royal humiliation continues, drifting from tournament fields to banquet halls, from the crack of lances to the choke of cream and bread. Power, always fragile, always absurd, reveals itself most clearly in the way it ends. And for Adolf Frederick, the throne of Sweden will forever be remembered as a chair pulled up to a table too full, where glory ended not with a sword, but with a spoon. Wine has always carried two faces, one of joy, the other of treachery. In the flickering light of great halls, goblets have been raised to seal alliances, to toast victories, to honour marriages. Yet the same liquid, shimmering red as blood, has carried whispers of betrayal through the ages. In the stillness of a banquet, when the music swells and laughter distracts, the most fatal of gifts can be slipped into a cup, invisible, silent, and merciless. Few monarchs embodied this irony more painfully than Tsar Ivan IV of Russia, remembered to history as Ivan the Terrible. His reign thundered with cruelty, yet his end came not by sword or rebellion, but by a cup raised in what should have been routine ceremony. It was a death as humiliating as it was grotesque, a reminder that even tyrants could be undone in the most ordinary of acts. The years had weighed heavily on Ivan. His body, once formidable, had grown bloated and diseased from excess and paranoia. Yet he clung to ritual. Each evening he dined in chambers hung with heavy drapery, guards posted at the doors, tables spread with meats, breads and goblets of strong wine. Around him sat boyars, nobles who both feared and despised him, their faces masks of obedience, their thoughts unreadable. In that charged silence, the chalice became more than a vessel for drink. It was a stage where loyalty or betrayal might play itself out. And on that final evening, betrayal won. Accounts differ, as they often do, but all agree that something was slipped into his wine. Perhaps it was mercury, perhaps arsenic, perhaps a darker concoction brewed in secret by hands desperate to end his reign. To the eye, it looked the same. Red liquid swirling under candlelight, reflecting back the tired face of a king. Ivan lifted it without suspicion. He had survived countless conspiracies, crushed revolts, executed those who even looked like threats. Yet he never imagined that death might hide in the very goblet he held. He drank deeply, his lips stained with wine, and for a moment nothing seemed amiss. But then, slowly, the poison revealed itself. His chest tightened, his vision blurred, his limbs weakened beneath him. The mighty Tsar, who had ruled with iron and terror, slumped forward, choking on the very toast he had raised. Servants rushed, courtiers panicked, but no aid could undo the invisible hand already tightening around him. His body convulsed, his face contorted, and then he lay still upon the floor, his chalice overturned, its contents spreading like a dark stain across the table. The humiliation was not only in the manner of his death, but in the contrast to his life. Here was a man who had burned cities, executed thousands, shattered nobles and peasants alike, and yet his final battle was lost, not to armies, but to a few drops of poison delivered in silence. For all his terror, he could not see betrayal hiding in a cup. And as with all such deaths, whispers spread faster than proclamations. The boyars, outwardly grieving, exchanged glances heavy with unspoken knowledge. The people, long rushed under his reign, murmured that it was divine justice, that God himself had slipped poison into the Tsar's goblets, punishing him in the most humiliating way. His enemies abroad laughed at the irony, and even his allies must have winced at the indignity. The chalice itself became a symbol, a quiet reminder that power is most fragile at the table. One may control armies, dictate laws, and terrify nations, yet still be undone at dinner by a hand that tips powder into a cup. It was an ending both absurd and fitting, for what could be more embarrassing for a tyrant than to die not in the grandeur of battle, but in the weakness of his own indulgence? His body was laid to rest with ceremony, priests chanting, candles burning, relics displayed. Yet no grandeur could erase the truth whispered beyond the cathedral walls. Ivan the Terrible had died with wine on his lips and poison in his veins. His reign ended not with thunder, but with a choking gasp in a dimly lit chamber. What lingers is not merely the grotesque scene, but the lesson it carries. Poison is the most mocking of assassins. It leaves no spectacle of courage, no chance for defence, no battlefield glory. It makes a monarch's death indistinguishable from that of a common man betrayed by a drink. It strips away the myth of invincibility and leaves only the body, frail and betrayed, sprawled beside a cup that once promised pleasure. And so the story flows onward, from jousts to banquets, from laughter to gluttony, from crowns to chalices, weaving a tapestry of humiliation that binds rulers across centuries. For kings and emperors alike, death comes not only in battle or in bed, but also in the ordinary rituals of life, in the food they eat, in the wine they drink, in the moments when they believe themselves safest. The chalice, raised high in celebration, passes silently through history, its rim stained by the lips of those who never imagined their final act would be so absurd. And in the hush of that poisoned room, one can almost hear the faint echo of laughter, not of joy, but of history itself, amused by the way it chooses to end its most terrible kings. Night has always been the great leveller. By day, monarchs are elevated above all others, wrapped in silks, shaded by canopies, and followed by the endless procession of flatterers and guards. But when the torches are extinguished and curtains drawn, a king or queen lies just as vulnerable as the humblest servant. In that twilight world of sleep, all crowns slip away, and all power seems suspended. It is in this intimate space the bedchamber, where some of the most humiliating royal endings unfolded, quiet, awkward, and stripped of ceremony. Among these tales, the death of King Adolf Frederick of Sweden casts a peculiar shadow. He was no warrior king, no conqueror of realms. His reign was fragile, a patchwork of compromises with parliament, a life spent more in negotiation than in grand campaigns. He is remembered not for the weight of laws or victories, but for a single indulgence that sent him to his grave. A monarch undone not by war, nor by rebellion, but by desert. The story began on a February evening in 1771, when winter pressed heavily upon Stockholm. The king dined in his palace, the air filled with the scent of roasted meats, baked breads, and stewed cabbages, hearty foods meant to fortify against the snow piling outside. Yet for Adolf Frederick, the centrepiece was not the meal itself, but the sweet that followed. He had a weakness, an unquenchable fondness for semler, a delicate bun filled with almond paste and crowned with whipped cream, served in a bowl of hot milk. That night, he indulged with abandon. One bun became 2, then 3, then more. Alongside them he consumed platters of lobster, herring and sauerkraut, washing it all down with generous gulps of champagne. Courtiers looked on nervously, for even by the standards of royal excess this was dangerous. But who would tell a king to stop? Servants filled his bowl again and again, the cream swirling like snowdrifts, the almonds crushed to paste, until at last he had eaten 14 semlor in a single sitting. At first there was only the heavy sigh of satisfaction, the king reclining in his chair as the feast settled within him. But the body, no matter how royal, has its limits. Soon discomfort crept in, then sharp pain. His stomach churned violently against the excess. His breath came short, and the joy of indulgence gave way to panic. Servants rushed to his side, physicians summoned in haste, but the chamber had already turned from feast hall to deathbed. Within hours, the king's heart faltered under the weight of his gluttony, and darkness swept over him. So it was that Adolf Frederick of Sweden died not in battle, nor from dagger or poison, but from eating too much dessert. The court dressed it in solemn language, announcing his passing with all the gravity due to a monarch, but outside the palace walls, the truth became a source of whispered amusement across Europe. A king felled by whipped cream, a sovereign undone by almond paste. It was as if history itself had chosen to mock him in his final act, leaving behind a tale so absurd it could never be erased. The embarrassment grew in retelling. In salons and taverns, his death was repeated with chuckles, exaggerated with every telling. 14 buns became 16, 16 became 20, until he was imagined as drowning in milk and cream, swallowed by the very sweetness he adored. Other monarchs, often remembered for their cruelty or grandeur, faded into dusty chronicles, but Adolf Frederick was immortalized as the king who ate himself to death. There is something almost tragic in the intimacy of his end. A bedchamber lit by flickering candles, the groaning of a man undone by his own appetite. The helpless attendants standing near, knowing no crown could shield him from the consequences of excess. Unlike the spectacle of a battlefield, or the drama of assassination, this was a death stripped of dignity, softened by pillows, muted by heavy curtains, yet sharpened by its ridiculousness. And still, in that absurdity lies the larger truth. Monarchs are most fragile not in their wars, but in their private comforts. For what humiliation could be greater than to be remembered not for the grandeur of rule, but for the quiet foolishness of a final indulgence? Adolf Frederick's entire reign is now eclipsed by a single evening's feast. His policies forgotten, his treaties erased, his legacy bound forever to the steaming bowls of semla that sat upon his table. It is fitting, in its way, that the story lingers not with sorrow, but with the odd, dreamlike amusement that history sometimes grants. One imagines the silence of that bedchamber after his last breath, the shadows deepening, the feast still laid out upon the table, cream beginning to collapse, the air heavy with the smell of lobster and almond. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, as if to bury the moment beneath layers of white, yet the embarrassment survived, carried in whispers through the streets, etched into chronicles with the ink of irony. The night closed around the palace, and with it the chapter of his reign. The torches guttered, servants moved softly through the halls, and the city of Stockholm, unaware of the exact details, slept on in the cold. But in time the truth would emerge, and the world would learn that one of Europe's kings had died not of violence or betrayal, but of gluttony. The bedchamber, usually a place of quiet dignity, had become instead the theatre of his humiliation, a room where darkness claimed him in silence, while the remnants of a feast bore witness. So history turns its gaze from crowns and thrones to bowls and spoons, from laws and wars to whipped cream and almonds, weaving this strange, embarrassing thread into the tapestry of royal mortality. For the grandeur of monarchy is fragile, and death often chooses its moment not in the blaze of glory, but in the stillness of ordinary acts. When a king sits at the table, or slips into bed, or raises a cup, believing himself secure. And it is in those moments, in those sudden descents into darkness, that history finds its cruelest laughter. For rulers draped in silks and crowned with diadems, the weight of dignity is often heavier than any armour. They are expected to glide through their palaces as if their very footsteps carry destiny, to mount their horses with elegance, to descend staircases as though the world itself bends in deference. Yet gravity remains a relentless equalizer, indifferent to ceremony, and it has brought more than one mighty sovereign crashing down in moments that turned majesty into farce. The story of Byzantine Emperor John I Tzimiskes reminds us how absurdly fragile imperial dignity could be. He was no weak monarch, but a soldier hardened in campaigns, a man who seized the purple throne through cunning and force. His reign was carved from ambition, his name carried by legions, his authority etched across the Eastern Empire. Yet when the moment of his fall came, it was not on a battlefield or at the tip of an assassin's blade. It was upon the very stage where emperors were meant to appear untouchable, the ceremonial procession. In the great city of Constantinople, spectacles were crafted not merely as displays, but as weapons of power. To be seen in grandeur was to be believed invincible. Processions wound through the hippodrome, down marble avenues, past the Hagia Sophia's soaring dome, where subjects craned their necks to glimpse the man who called himself God's chosen. The emperor rode high, lifted by gilded stirrups, a living symbol of permanence. But permanence is an illusion, and the cobblestones beneath his horse had no interest in imperial ceremony. It was on one such procession that Tzimiskes mounted his steed, adorned in gleaming armour, a vision of triumph. The sun caught the edges of his helmet, banners fluttered, trumpets sounded. The crowd roared as the emperor, conqueror of Bulgars and protector of Byzantium, paraded past. But amid the fanfare, his horse stumbled, jolted by some unseen stone, and with it the emperor was pitched forward. What followed was not a noble dismount, not the controlled descent of a seasoned rider, but an ungainly tumble. The emperor of Byzantium, supreme ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, crashed to the ground in full view of his subjects. The clang of his armour reverberated against the stones, his crown skewed awkwardly, and courtiers rushed, with panic, not to aid his bruised body, but to salvage the fragments of dignity scattering across the avenue. For the people who watched, the moment was jarring. The man who had been lifted to semi-divine status, who ruled as if ordained by heaven, suddenly looked all too human. His fall was not only physical, it was symbolic. To see him sprawled on the ground, covered in dust, reduced to the same vulnerability as any labourer tripped in the street, shattered the illusion that the Emperor floated above earthly frailty. Though John survived the fall, embarrassment clung to his reign like a stain. For enemies at court, it became a whispered metaphor. The Emperor, who had risen by seizing another's throne, had in the eyes of fate already begun to tumble. Rumours spread that the fall was not mere chance, but an omen, a divine signal that heaven disapproved of his rule. In Byzantium, where signs and portents were read with fervour, such whispers carried weight. His tumble became legend, retold as though gravity itself had pronounced judgment upon him. And history, with its cruel sense of humour, ensured that his end would only deepen the irony. Not long after his public humiliation, Tzimiskes succumbed not to war or rebellion, but to sudden illness. Some say poison slipped into his cup. Others claim disease. But what remains is the image of an emperor whose ascent to glory was undone first by a stumble before the people, then by death that arrived quietly in his palace. He had risen high, yet fate made certain that he fell, not just metaphorically, but literally before the eyes of the empire. Nor was he alone in such indignities. Centuries later, another emperor, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, would meet an end that echoed with similar absurdity. He had marched proudly on crusade, banners aloft, armies stretching across the horizon. His name was legend, his ambition vast. Yet in Asia Minor, seeking to cross a river swollen with spring currents, he mounted his horse and attempted the passage. The river, cold and indifferent, swept him under. Before his men could save him, the great Frederick, Emperor of the West, had drowned like any peasant caught in the torrent. The image spread like wildfire. A man who commanded kingdoms, undone by water waist deep. These moments cling because they strip away the illusions carefully spun around monarchy, the elaborate ceremonies, the jewelled crowns, the golden palanquins, all are powerless against a loose stone in the road, a misstep by a horse, a river flowing too swiftly. History rarely delights in justice, but it often delights in irony. And nothing is more ironic than to watch a ruler who imagined himself untouchable, brought low by the simplest forces of nature. One can almost picture the silence that follows such falls. A crowd stunned into stillness, unsure whether to gasp in horror or smother a laugh. Courtiers rushing forward, hands trembling, torn between helping their sovereign and concealing the comedy of his plight. The emperor himself, humiliated, struggling to rise with what dignity he could muster, knowing the moment would haunt him long after the bruises faded. For it is not merely the fall itself that shames, but the memory of it. The whispers that ripple through markets, the smirks exchanged in taverns, the scribes who record the tale with too much relish. Time itself preserves the stumble, polishing it brighter than any jewel in the crown. Armies and treaties may vanish from the chronicles, but the fall remains. Thus the bedchamber, where Adolf Frederick succumbed to gluttony, fades into the avenue where John Tzimiskes toppled from his horse, and the riverbank where Frederick Barbarossa slipped beneath the water. One by one, the palaces, the parades, the crusades dissolve into a single theme. Rulers undone not by the grand designs of destiny, but by the small, merciless interventions of chance. And as the night deepens in this long, meandering account, we are left with the strange comfort that even emperors cannot escape the indignities of ordinary misfortune. For gravity does not kneel, rivers do not bow, and cobblestones do not care for crowns. History, with its patient hand, writes these falls in ink that does not fade, so that the mighty may forever be remembered, not just for their triumphs, but for the moments when grace abandoned them, and they fell, literally and humiliatingly, before the eyes of the world. For kings and queens, the bath was not a mere luxury, but a sanctuary, a place where the weight of court, the clamour of servants, and the heavy expectation of rule dissolved into steam. Within the tiled chambers, the ruler was meant to be reborn each time, cleansed not only of sweat and dust, but of worry itself. Marble tubs were carved to resemble thrones. Perfumed waters were poured with reverence, and attendants hovered silently as though presiding over a sacred rite. Yet even in this realm of comfort and privacy, fate often whispered its cruelest jokes. Few stories capture that irony more vividly than the death of King Wenceslas III of Bohemia, who entered his bath expecting refreshment and instead met the assassin's blade. It was a summer evening in Olomouc in the year 1306, and the young king, barely in his 20s, carried the exhaustion of a troubled reign upon his shoulders. He was heir to thrones stretching from Poland to Hungary, yet his claim was contested at every turn. Enemies pressed him, allies abandoned him, and whispers of betrayal followed wherever he went. The bath that evening was meant to soothe, to soften his weariness with warm water and oils. The chamber flickered with lamplight, steam curling lazily toward the vaulted ceiling. Attendants had left him to privacy, believing their monarch safe within guarded walls. But safety is an illusion, and the stillness of that bath masked the danger drawing near. The assassin slipped inside as silently as steam disperses, and when the blade struck, the water that had been meant to cleanse became stained instead. The tub that symbolized comfort transformed instantly into a coffin, and the young king's life ended not with trumpet or ceremony, but with a splash that echoed against the stone. His body sank beneath the water, his crownless head slumping forward, and with it died the last male heir of the Przemyslid dynasty. The embarrassment lay not only in the death itself, but in its setting. For a warrior king to fall on the battlefield is one thing, to perish in armour with sword in hand is a death sung in chronicles. But to be cut down naked in one's bath, defenceless and unaware, is to be remembered with an awkward mixture of pity and shame. His enemies mocked his end, portraying it as divine punishment, as though the gods themselves had chosen to strip him of dignity before extinguishing his line. And he was not alone in this watery humiliation. The Roman Emperor Caracalla, a man notorious for cruelty, was also struck down in the vulnerability of relieving himself by the roadside, a detail so indecorous that historians could never forget it. Centuries later, William the Conqueror, who had built an empire with steel, would die in a chamber of fire and fumigation, his body swollen and bursting in grotesque spectacle. But the bath, with its intimacy, adds another layer of absurdity. The very space meant for cleansing became the stage of defilement. The bath, in royal imagination, was often a place of rebirth, where a ruler shed the grime of rule and emerged renewed. Yet in history, it has too often been where mortality came most unannounced. Consider Henry VI of England, long tormented by bouts of madness, who in his prison chambers was murdered, some whisper drowned, others whisper stabbed, his captors choosing the solitude of water and shadows to end him quietly. The theme persists, water as solace, turned suddenly to shroud. One can almost hear the quiet of such rooms after the deed, the candles still burning, the water still rippling gently against the marble. As though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Outside, courtiers continued their chatter, unaware that their monarch was gone, that the realm itself had shifted beneath their feet. There is a peculiar cruelty in that contrast. The slow drip of water in an empty bath, paired with the enormity of a kingdom losing its ruler. History seems determined to record these deaths not with reverence, but with a kind of smirking memory. A bath is a private, human act, stripped of robes and regalia. To die, there is to be remembered at one's most ordinary, one's most vulnerable. No court artist painted Wenceslaus in his tub. No triumphal arch recorded the splash that ended his reign. And yet that moment endures far more vividly than his laws or his campaigns. The dynasty that had ruled Bohemia for centuries ended not with a coronation or a coronach, but with a silent figure slumped beneath soapy water. It reminds us that humiliation in death often lies not in violence itself, but in setting. A king may die bravely, but if the place of his death is absurd, history will remember the absurdity above all else. Palaces crumble, crowns melt, dynasties vanish. But the image of a monarch floating lifeless in his own bath lingers stubbornly. The continuity of these humiliations reveals something both unsettling and oddly soothing. The grandeur of power is always at risk of collapsing into the ordinary, and the ordinary, when joined with death, becomes indelibly comic. In the bath, the emperor and the beggar are the same, stripped, submerged, silent. And when the hand of fate enters those tiled chambers, no crown or seal of office can keep the water from closing over them. The steam fades, the lamps gutter, the attendants return too late, and history, with its wry smile, adds another tale to its collection. A king undone not by battle, not by rebellion, but by the bath that was meant to refresh him. The chamber grows cold, the tub becomes a coffin, and the story slips forward, always searching for the next moment where majesty and embarrassment collide. The symbols of royalty are meant to uplift, but they are also weights. Crowns press against temples, sceptres must be gripped until hands grow weary, and cloaks, woven with gold thread and lined with fur, hang across shoulders like anchors. These garments are designed not for comfort, but for spectacle, to remind those watching that the monarch bears not only fabric, but the burden of rule itself. Yet there are moments when this symbolism shifts from grandeur to absurdity, when the weight of such regalia becomes quite literally unbearable. The tale of King George II of Great Britain lingers here, for his reign ended in a manner both unceremonious and strangely tethered to the trappings of monarchy. George had grown old, and with age came the indignities of a body reluctant to obey the rituals expected of it. He still attended ceremonies draped in the rich robes of state, but the garments no longer sat easily upon him. The heavy coronation cloak, long after his crowning, remained a recurring burden in his public appearances, tugging at his frail frame until the illusion of majesty seemed more like a test of endurance. Though his actual death came not beneath the cloak itself, but after the strain of daily life, it was inseparable from the symbolism. One morning in 1760, while attending to his private needs, George collapsed suddenly, stricken as he sat upon the toilet. The body that had endured years of ceremonial weight had given way at last to the invisible pressures of gay and dignity combined. The physicians spoke of ruptured vessels, of a heart undone, but what the people remembered was simpler. A king who had worn robes too grand for his shoulders, and died in a room too humble for his title. The cloak became a kind of metaphor in the retelling. Stories whispered through drawing rooms of how George had seemed crushed by the very garments meant to elevate him. of how the weight of expectation pressed as surely as the gold-threaded velvet. And though courtiers tried to soften the embarrassment, history did not. His passing was remembered with irony, as though the crown itself had grown too heavy for his frail frame, driving him into the shadows of mortality in the most undignified of settings. Other monarchs, too, found themselves betrayed by their own ceremonial splendour. Consider Emperor Joseph I of the Holy Roman Empire, who, weakened by illness, found the long processions in heavy robes exhausting, each step dragging as courtiers tried to conceal his failing strength. The garments were meant to signal immortality of office, yet they revealed instead the fragility of flesh beneath. Even Louis XVI, dressed in elaborate regalia on the morning of his execution, seemed swallowed by fabric, his figure diminished by the very cloak intended to exalt him. There is something haunting in this image. Rulers weighed down not by wars or debts or rebellions, but by their own costumes. The coronation cloak, so often described as majestic, was in truth an oppressive fabric, stitched for show, suffocating in its thickness. To wear it too long, or to bow beneath its folds, was to invite disaster. In some cases, monarchs stumbled during ceremonies, tripping over their trains, caught in the very garments designed to display control. The irony of it all never escaped the chroniclers, who delighted in pointing out how kings and queens, wrapped in splendour, found themselves ensnared in their own grandeur. It is easy to imagine George II, weary after decades of rule, shuffling into his chambers after ceremonies, attendants rushing to peel away the cloak that seemed to drag him toward the ground. The sigh of relief, the loosening of fabric, the frail frame finally freed of velvet and ermine. Yet in memory, his story is condensed to the cruelest detail, that his reign ended not with majesty, but with a sudden collapse, a moment both private and absurd, as though the burden of robes had followed him even into solitude. The coronation cloak, then, becomes more than cloth. It is history's quiet jest, the reminder that pageantry can consume those it is meant to glorify. For the monarch who wore it, the garment was a prison of expectations. For those who watched, it was proof of how fragile power truly was. When the cloak slipped from shoulders, it revealed not a demigod, but a mortal, breathing, sweating, stumbling, and finally succumbing. The silence of that moment lingers, the stillness after the fall. The throne room stands empty, the cloak folded away, the crown gleaming coldly on a velvet cushion. Courtiers whisper, attendants tidy, and yet the embarrassment remains, woven into the fabric itself. Generations later, historians still recall not the victories of George's reign, but the strange, dignity-stripped image of its end, shadowed by the weight of robes too heavy to bear. And so the story drifts onward, from the banquet tables and the hunting fields, from the baths and the bedchambers, into this space where garments themselves become instruments of humiliation. It is as though history, with a patient hand, insists on reminding us again and again, the trappings of royalty are not armour, but chains. Velvet drags, gold weighs, ermine suffocates, and in the end the cloak is always heavier than the shoulders beneath it. The world of courts was built upon illusion. Beneath ceilings painted with heavens and walls gilded to resemble eternity, nobles danced in masks, their identities concealed, but their ambitions barely hidden. The masquerade ball, with its layers of costume and pretense, was more than an evening diversion. It was a stage upon which the delicate balance of appearances, secrets, and alliances played itself out. Yet in this world of disguises, there were moments when the performance turned against its players, when death itself stepped into the masquerade as an uninvited partner. One such night unfolded in the glittering palaces of France, where Louis XIV's legacy of endless pageantry still clung to every mirrored hall. It was a court accustomed to artifice, where nobles learned early that survival meant wearing masks long after the ball was over. The masquerade was an ideal stage for both flirtation and betrayal, but for some, it became the last stage of all. The tale is often whispered of Henri II of France, a king who adored tournaments, masks, and spectacles. During one of these grand entertainments, he donned his finery to preside over a festival of jousts and masks. Yet the festival, intended to celebrate unity and strength, ended with an image of fragility that could not be undone. In a match fought for sport, a splintered lance struck the king in the eye, piercing through the mask he wore for protection. The crowd gasped as pageantry gave way to panic, and the monarch, who had so carefully cultivated his image as a figure of magnificence, was carried away bleeding, his mask shattered and useless in the grass. For days he lingered, the wound festering, courtiers circling like carrion around the fading power of his body. His death came not in the throne room or in battle, but as a grotesque accident in the middle of a celebration. The masquerade of court life had betrayed him, stripping away his dignity at the moment meant to display his majesty. His widow, Catherine de' Medici, would remember that splinter for the rest of her life, as though it were not wood, but fate itself that had pierced the illusion of their golden court. But Henri was not alone in meeting such an end. Across Europe, masquerades carried their own dangers. In the dimly lit halls, masked strangers approached with whispers and laughter, but hidden among them were plots and poisoners. Some nobles drank from cups laced with venom, their collapse mistaken at first for drunken folly. Others collapsed under the suffocating heat of their elaborate costumes, unable to endure the hours of dance beneath heavy velvet and feathers. Death in such moments seemed absurd, almost theatrical, yet it was often no less real than the staged dramas performed in the court theatres. There is a story of a Venetian ball, where nobles cloaked in silk and glittering jewels swayed beneath chandeliers. The air was thick with perfume and the faint bitterness of candle smoke. There, a duke, aging, proud, unwilling to relinquish his place at the centre of attention, collapsed suddenly in mid-dance. His mask slipped from his face, revealing the paling flesh beneath as he gasped for breath. For a few moments, the courtiers thought it part of the performance, an elaborate jest. Only when the music faltered did the horror set in. Death had arrived masked, and the dance could not conceal it. It was this cruel contrast, the brilliance of costume against the weakness of flesh, that gave such deaths their enduring place in memory. The masquerade was supposed to conceal imperfections, to elevate mortals into living symbols. Yet when a king or noble died in the midst of such artifice, it revealed the ultimate futility of disguise. Beneath velvet and feathers, behind gilded masks, the body was still vulnerable, the heart still mortal, the breath still fragile. Some chroniclers delighted in the irony. They described how courtiers, still clad in their animal masks and gilded visors, scrambled awkwardly to summon physicians, their costumes turning tragedy into farce. Others noted how silence spread across ballrooms once filled with music, the chandeliers flickering as if the very candles had grown ashamed. The masquerade ended abruptly, masks removed, faces pale, the performance cut short by the blunt arrival of mortality. The most haunting aspect of these stories is not the death itself, but how quickly the court resumed its performances. After Henry II's death, Catherine de' Medici turned mourning into yet another display, her black gowns as carefully chosen as the masks once worn in celebration. In Venice, after the Duke collapsed, another ball was scheduled only weeks later. As if to cover the embarrassment, with new layers of glitter and perfume. It was as though the court believed it could dance away the memory of death that the illusion would hold if only the masks were never removed for too long. Yet history remembers differently. The masquerade lingers in the imagination not as a triumph of spectacle, but as a stage where power revealed its frailty. A king blinded by splinters, a duke gasping in silk, nobles poisoned at tables, dancers collapsing beneath feathered masks. All are reminders that grandeur cannot conceal mortality for long. The masquerade may have hidden faces, but it could not hide the truth that even the most exalted among them were bound to stumble, to falter, to fall. When the chandeliers dimmed and the final guest departed, the halls grew quiet again. The masks were discarded, the music silenced, the costumes folded away. Only the echo of footsteps remained, carrying with them the memory of one last, humiliating truth. In the final masquerade of the court, the mask does not protect, the dance cannot save, and death always knows exactly who is behind the disguise. There are few places where power has ever looked more invincible than in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Light itself was summoned into that gallery, multiplied into infinity by the tall mirrors facing the endless rows of windows. The sun glared through the glass, fractured into sparks of brilliance, until every visitor believed they were stepping into something greater than a palace corridor. It was a kingdom's reflection stretched into eternity, a place where kings could imagine themselves immortal. But immortality, as the hall would eventually show, was only an illusion. The mirrors were witnesses to triumphs and treaties, to celebrations where kings and queens paraded their majesty as though the glass confirmed their divine right to rule. Yet those same mirrors, so eager to multiply splendour, were also silent observers of fragility and humiliation. For in this place designed to make rulers appear untouchable, death found ways to intrude, and it came in the most unflattering, almost mocking forms. The hall was meant for ceremonies that proclaimed strength, royal marriages, diplomatic victories, treaties sealed with pen and flourish. But behind its shimmering surface, there were nights when courtiers whispered of monarchs who grew pale under the chandeliers, whose knees trembled as they struggled with the sheer weight of the performance demanded of them. One death in particular has lingered, not because it was noble, but because it was anything but. Louis XV, who once basked in the golden light of Versailles, found himself diminished before the very palace meant to glorify him. Though his final illness struck beyond the mirrors, its humiliation echoed back through the galleries, where courtiers remembered too vividly the smell that lingered in the air. The once beloved bien-aimé, who had danced beneath the chandeliers in his youth, ended his reign not with majesty, but with avoidance. Nobles recoiled from his chambers, whispering that the pox had stained not only his body, but his legacy. The mirrors, gleaming coldly, reflected none of his youthful charm, only the silence that followed his passing. Yet Louis was not the only one whom Versailles beheld. During ceremonies in that glittering gallery, courtiers themselves sometimes collapsed, their powdered wigs slipping askew, their brocaded coats smudged with sweat, as they tried to stand motionless for hours beneath suffocating layers of silk. One duke, pressing too firmly into his stays, fainted before the mirrors, his fall reverberating across the marble floor. For days the court laughed about it, but beneath the laughter was the sharp edge of recognition. The same fate might one day strike them too, and the mirrors would not turn away. It is said that one evening, during a grand masquerade staged in that hall, a noblewoman, her costume so elaborate that her mask brushed the crystals of the chandeliers, began to cough violently. The room tried to ignore it, as etiquette demanded, But the coughing grew louder, sharper, until her body shook uncontrollably. She staggered, arms reaching for balance, her reflection multiplied dozens of times in the mirrors around her. For a breathless moment, she seemed surrounded by her own suffering, countless versions of herself gasping, struggling, failing. When she fell, silence consumed the hall. The music stopped. The only sound was the faint echo of her body striking marble, repeated endlessly by the unforgiving reflections. These were the moments that stripped away the masquerade of grandeur. The Hall of Mirrors, designed to immortalize glory, instead exposed embarrassment with cruel precision. There was no way to soften the fall of a body on stone, no way to disguise the awkward flailing of limbs in the polished glass. Every fainting courtier, every stumbling dancer, every monarch pale and sweating under the gilded chandeliers became part of a spectacle they had not chosen. And the mirrors, cold and unblinking, preserved each moment as though mocking the very idea of control. The silence that followed these events was unlike the silence of reverence. It was not the hush of awe before magnificence, but the uneasy quiet of witnesses too afraid to acknowledge what they had seen. Etiquette demanded composure, but the glass had already betrayed them. It had shown the truth in merciless detail. Kings were frail, queens were mortal, nobles were clumsy, and even the most carefully staged illusions could shatter with a single misstep. When later generations walked through the hall, they still saw its beauty, its grandeur, its endless reflections. But some claimed they also felt the weight of those silences, the echoes of moments when the performance broke apart. The mirrors, polished anew, seemed almost too bright, as if determined to blind visitors to the memories they carried. Yet no polish can erase the truth of history. The hall had witnessed glory, yes, but it had also witnessed humiliation, the kind of embarrassment that lingers longer than triumph because it strips away the very image rulers work so hard to preserve. The Hall of Mirrors remains, glittering as ever, its chandeliers swaying gently in the draughts of passing centuries. Tourists step into it now, marvelling at the beauty, lifting cameras to catch the light. Few think of the fainting dukes or the collapsing dancers. Few imagine the silence after a noble's last cough echoed off the marble. But the mirrors still remember. They hold within them not just the multiplied images of power, but the unflinching reflections of weakness. And in that way, they remind us of the same truth whispered through every story of royal death. No mask, no palace, no mirror can conceal mortality forever. Beneath the gilding and grandeur, behind the reflections of infinite majesty, there waits only silence, the kind of silence that fills a hall when the music stops, the candles gutter, and the performance is over. The Hall of Mirrors, for all its brilliance, teaches its visitors this lesson in the quietest of ways. For what could be more embarrassing for kings and queens who believed themselves eternal than to have their frailty reflected endlessly, multiplied into eternity until silence itself becomes their final legacy? And so the night leaves us with strange company, crowns that slipped, banquets that turned silent, hunts that betrayed their hunters, laughter that carried a queen too far, and masquerades where even the brightest mirrors could not hide the frailty of flesh. These were rulers who believed themselves eternal, yet their final moments remind us of something far more fragile, that beneath velvet, jewels and ceremony, they were as vulnerable as the rest of us. What we have wandered through tonight is not just history, but the irony of history. Moments when power stumbled, when majesty was unmasked, when death arrived not as a noble martyrdom, but as an almost comical accident. And perhaps that is why these stories linger. They whisper a truth that is both humbling and strangely comforting. Even kings can fall. Even queens can falter. Even emperors can meet an end that makes courtiers laugh nervously behind their fans. So as the candle burns lower, I ask you, what stood out to you most tonight? Was it the crown that betrayed its own king, or the banquet where joy curdled into silence? Was it the hunter undone by his own hunt, or the masquerade where laughter froze in the hall of mirrors? Each of these stories leaves its own shadow, and I would love to hear which one still echoes in your thoughts as the night stretches on. Share your answer in the comments below. I always read them, and together we weave a map of quiet voices, remembering the strange theatre of history. And if tonight's journey has lulled you into stillness, or if you've found a kind of calm in these embarrassing echoes of power, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. That way, these tales can continue reaching others across the world, tiny lights glowing in the darkness, keeping us all company as history hums its softer, stranger songs. For now, let the silence settle. Rest easy, knowing that even in history's grandest halls, awkwardness had its throne. Good night.